Eastern Europe isn't waiting. With Russia tearing through Ukraine and NATO looking weaker, countries on Putin's doorstep are making a choice: arm up or risk being next. A massive military buildup is already underway, but why now? Who's leading it, and which nations are already in Russia's sights? Let's break it down. We start with why. In a March 8th YouTube video, the German public broadcast service ZDF Heute Nachrichten, or ZDF, explained that Europe is worried about the US. It has every reason to be. Trump and Putin are dissolving old certainties. The future of NATO is at stake, the outlet proclaims, and it isn't wrong. The last couple of months have been a roller coaster in terms of US policy, especially when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Before he came to office, US President Donald Trump proudly proclaimed that he would end the war between Ukraine and Russia in just one day. It's been almost 2 months at this point, and that claim has clearly gone unfulfilled. However, that doesn't mean that America's president hasn't been busy. On February 12th, Trump took an unprecedented step. Reversing nearly 3 years of American policy, Trump picked up the phone and called Vladimir Putin. That direct call lasted for 90 minutes and marked Russia's most serious diplomatic breakthrough since Putin started his supposed special military operation in February 2022. Trump and Putin spoke about formally beginning negotiations to end the war. As for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he only received a phone call after Trump had spoken to Putin. The Guardian says that this laid the foundation for Trump's approach to the Ukraine war: speak to Putin first, then lay the terms of the conversation down to Zelensky. The call seemed to mark a turnaround in US policy, not only towards Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe. In its immediate aftermath, the US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth ruled out any possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. 2 days later, Vice President J.D. Vance used his speaking time at the Munich Defense Conference to ignore Ukraine and go on a savage attack against Europe, accusing the continent of retreating from its most fundamental values. Then came the meeting. On February 18th, delegates from Trump and Putin's camps met in Saudi Arabia to begin talks on a peace deal. No Ukrainian or European diplomats were present, which seemed to send a clear message to the European continent: the US and Russia are going to handle this without you. Following the meeting, Trump seemed to go on the warpath against Zelensky. Trump told Ukraine's leader that he'd had chances to make a deal with Putin many times over the previous 3 years. Trump also branded Zelensky a dictator and accused him of stifling elections by keeping Ukraine under martial law. America's seemingly pro-Russian stance was affirmed on February 24th, when the US voted against a United Nations resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That marked the first time since Putin invaded that the US voted against a resolution that backed Ukraine. 4 days later, Trump and Zelensky met at the White House for the first time. The meeting was explosive, with Trump and Vance sending constant jabs towards Zelensky as Ukraine's president fired back. The immediate aftermath saw the Trump administration suspend US military aid and prevent its European allies from sharing intelligence with Ukraine. Is it any wonder that the rest of Europe is worried? In a single month, America's policy toward Russia seemed to do an about-face. Once Russia's greatest enemy, the US now seemed to be cooperating with Putin to bring about a form of peace that would benefit Russia and harm Ukraine. There's been another turnaround since then. On March 12th, delegates from Trump and Zelensky's camps met in Saudi Arabia. They emerged with an agreement on a 30-day ceasefire that would see both sides in the Ukraine conflict suspend all land, air, and sea operations. The US reinstituted its military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine, signaling that it may now be on Ukraine's side. As we said, it's been an absolute rollercoaster, and many countries in Eastern and Central Europe have had enough. This constant flip-flopping in US policy isn't providing the sort of level-headed and stable military leadership that Europe is used to enjoying. America has become a wild card in many nations' eyes, and it's that wild card status that's inspiring a massive military buildup. The countries closest to Ukraine, and especially those that share borders with Russia or its ally Belarus, are arming themselves to the teeth. That brings us to an obvious question: which countries are trying to make themselves stronger? Estonia, for one. One of the 3 Baltic states, along with Latvia and Lithuania, Estonia has a long history with Russia. The small country of just 1.37 million people was once part of the Soviet Union. It gained its independence on August 20th, 1991, with the remains of the Soviet Union recognizing that independence the following month. Estonia was free. Now it worries that Russia intends to target it next if Putin is successful in Ukraine. In Estonia, Russia has long been seen as an imperial aggressor that wants to retake Estonia under Putin. That's why America's recent actions have been a wake-up call to the nation. It already threw its support behind Ukraine, but with American policy seeming to change on a nearly daily basis, Estonia knows it needs to do more to defend itself. Right now it isn't ready. According to Global Firepower, or GBF, which ranks 145 military nations annually based on over 60 factors, Estonia has the 107th most powerful military in the world. That's a long way behind Russia, and it should come as no surprise. The tiny nation has a military with just 7,700 active personnel, though it also has 78,800 reserves, upon which it can call if it faces a Russian threat. Estonia also has 10,000 paramilitary forces, which are essentially militias and similar groups that are independent of the country's main military but typically act in support of their country. Estonia's tiny air force contains just 5 aircraft, most of which are helicopters, and it has a tiny 1,685 military vehicles. The country's navy isn't much better, with just 8 assets, 4 mine warfare ships and 4 patrol vessels. Still, it's doing everything it can to get stronger. On September 17, 2024, Estonia opened a military camp that allowed it to accommodate NATO forces close to the Russian border. That camp can accommodate 1,000 troops across 8 halls and serves as a vital link between Estonia and its NATO allies. The country's Minister of Defense, Hanno Pevkur, says the new camp serves a requirement for Estonia to be ready to host allies on a much larger scale according to NATO's new defense plans. That readiness includes providing vital supporting infrastructure, such as maintenance facilities and places to store equipment. It may not seem like much, but it's a start, with the camp helping to deepen Estonia's ties with the allies upon which it will rely, with or without US involvement, should it ever face a war with Russia. Estonia is also ramping up its military spending. In 2025, it plans to spend 3.4% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on defense. That's notable because it's substantially more than NATO's recommendation of 2% of GDP spending. It's also building closer ties with France, throwing its full support behind a French initiative to spend most of a planned multi-billion-dollar European Union military fund on European weapons, rather than those from the US. Estonia's Prime Minister, Kristen Michal, has also backed calls, made by Donald Trump, for NATO countries to hit 5% of GDP spending on defense. "We know our adversary," Michal said. "Just as Poland, Latvia and Lithuania must aim for 5% in defense spending, so must we." The messages coming out of Estonia are clear. We believe Russia is planning to invade, and we're no longer sure we can rely on US support. Still, it won't be enough. It can't be, with Estonia being such a small nation in comparison to Russia. Moscow's military dwarfs Estonia's much weaker force. However, Russia will face more than an Estonian military buildup if it invades. There are already more paramilitary and resistance groups forming in the country that are willing to stand against Putin even if he overruns Estonia. ZDF spoke to a woman named Ingrid Nielsen, who's part of one of these groups. She sees Russia as a major threat and wants to be part of any resistance that forms if Putin chooses to attack her country. That's why she joined an Estonia civil resistance group in the wake of Putin's Ukraine invasion. "The first news was so shocking that it took me several months to think about what would happen if something like that happened in Estonia," Nielsen tells ZDF. "Then my decision was quite clear." People like Nielsen are worried. To her, NATO, with Trump as US president, isn't what it used to be. "NATO has changed considerably in the last half year," she says. "There has been a kind of reality shock that it's not the only solution, but I also know that people's will to defend themselves is very strong, even on an individual level," she adds, before concluding with a chilling message. "Every bush shoots, that is the motto of the Estonian military." Estonia may not be the most powerful threat that Putin will face if he sets his sights beyond Ukraine, but that motto, coupled with Estonia's military buildup, demonstrates that he won't be dealing with an easy battle. And things will only get harder for Putin if he turns his attention to another former member of the Soviet Union, Poland. Like Estonia, Poland views Russia as a looming threat to its sovereignty. It's especially concerned because of what's known as the Suwalki Gap. Nestled along the borders of Poland and Lithuania, this 62-mile stretch of land is sometimes referred to as the most dangerous place on Earth. Why? It also has Belarus, which is one of Putin's closest allies, on its eastern border, and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad to its west. Politico says that the Suwalki Gap would likely be one of the first regions that hosted fighting if Russia goes to war with NATO, meaning Poland knows that it needs to be prepared. And it is. Over the last few years, Poland has slowly transformed its military into one of the strongest that Europe has to offer. GFP now ranks it as the 21st strongest nation on the planet, and it's far more ready to take on the might of Russia's military than Estonia. Poland's army currently has 202,100 active personnel, along with 350,000 reserves and 50,000 paramilitary forces, to create a total manpower pool of a little over 600,000. That's still smaller than the 1.3 million soldiers Russia would bring to a fight, but it's a strong enough force to hold off an invasion for months or even years, while Poland's allies figure out what to do next. Poland has also been investing in its air force, which now has 479 assets, including 59 fighter jets and 44 attack-type aircraft. It has 614 tanks, over 23,000 military vehicles and 677 units of self-propelled artillery, which is the 7th most in the world. Plus, its navy is growing. Right now, it has 62 assets, including 2 frigates, a pair of corvettes, and 26 mine warfare vessels. All of this comes as the result of substantial investment into the country's military to ensure it's prepared for a Russian invasion, and more is coming. On February 5th, Poland's President Andrzej Duda announced that his country plans to spend 4.7% of its GDP on defense in 2025. That amounts to around $32.5 billion, but more importantly, it makes Poland the highest defense spender in NATO based on GDP. It's also a 0.6% increase over the 4.1% of GDP that Poland spent in 2024. We have a permanent, strong American anti-missile base in Poland, Duda said when making the announcement. And we are continuing with the purchases of the most modern equipment for the Polish army. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has also privately agreed that Europe needs to spend more on its defense, according to Euronews. The European Union Commission says that the continent needs to invest at least $541 billion into defense over the next decade. If Poland maintains its current rate of military expenditure, it'll account for close to 60% of that investment alone. Much of that money is being plowed into what Poland calls the East Shield. Lying across the borders that Poland and the Baltic states share with Russia and Belarus, the East Shield is an array of border defenses designed to slow down any incoming hostile forces. Construction began on the initiative in November 2024, and it's believed the full project will cost Poland around $2.55 billion. The East Shield program involves the construction of a full network of fortifications, which includes anti-tank barriers such as tetrapods and dragon's teeth. These defenses will add to the 116-mile and 18-foot-high fence Poland built along its border with Belarus in 2022. At the time, the fence was built to prevent illegal border crossings. Now, along with the rest of the East Shield, it's perfect for slowing the Russian ground forces. That fence is also loaded with electronic devices and sensors that alert Polish authorities as soon as somebody attempts a crossing. Think of it as an early warning system for a ground invasion. As soon as Russia attempts to enter Poland, the alert is sent. The East Shield then slows those Russian forces down, giving Poland's military a chance to fortify and prepare its defenses. Poland's military buildup isn't stopping there. On March 7th, Donald Tusk announced that the Polish government is working on a plan that will introduce military training for every adult male in Poland. That plan is in aid of Tusk's belief that Poland needs an army of 500,000 soldiers, including reservists, to fend off the Russian threat. We will try to have a model ready by the end of this year so that every adult male in Poland is trained in the event of war, so that this reserve is really comparable and adequate to potential threats, Tusk said in a speech to Poland's lower houses of parliament. The plans also come amidst Poland's goal of increasing the size of its active army from 200,000 to 220,000 by the end of 2025. The country aims to hit 300,000 active service members overall, meaning the mandatory military training would help to supplement those numbers and provide the reservists needed in the event of a Russian invasion. Tusk has also backed Poland's withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention. This landmark treaty prohibits the use of anti-personnel landmines in conflict. Tusk is also considering Poland's withdrawal from the Dublin Convention, which places a similar ban on cluster munitions. Tusk's reasons are clear. Let's face it, it's not something nice, nothing pleasant. We know that very well, says Poland's Prime Minister. The problem is that in our environment, those we may be afraid of or those who are at war, they all have it. In other words, Russia is using anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions in Ukraine, so it's only fair that Poland fights fire with fire. Add to all of this Poland's efforts to gain access to nuclear weapons, likely working alongside France and the UK, and you get a nation that's building up its military because it sees a threat on the horizon. Finally, much like we see in Estonia, everyday Polish people are joining organizations that exist to resist Russia. These people include a historian named Miłosz Gierski. Speaking to ZDF, Gierski says that he joined a team of Polish volunteer medics when Russia invaded Ukraine. He's already been to the front lines of the Ukraine war multiple times, and he believes that a Russian assault on Poland or the Baltic states is inevitable. At some point, he says when speaking to ZDF, Russians don't think rationally. For them, their actions consist in the fact that they have to expand their empire, and indeed violently. For them, only power counts, and violence is what matters. That quote sheds light on why Poland and Estonia are building up their militaries. They don't want to fight. However, they believe there's no reasoning with Putin. They see Russia's leader as a man hell-bent on building an empire, and with America's repeated policy reversals also potentially weakening the collective threat that NATO poses to Putin, both nations want to be ready if they're forced into a fight. Not all countries in Eastern and Central Europe are able to build up in the same way. Take Georgia as an example. According to ZDF, Russia has occupied around 20% of that country since Putin started his 2008 war with the nation. It's also dealing with the influence wielded by a man named Bidzina Ivashnishvili. One of Georgia's wealthiest men, Ivashnishvili is an oligarch who has used his influence to guide Georgia away from the West. Thus, he creates a perfect atmosphere for Putin to expand his and Russia's influence in the small nation. There are elements of resistance in Georgia. ZDF spoke to one person who created a knowledge cafe. Her goal was to create a place where people could share ideas and escape the rampant Russian propaganda flooding into Georgia. That cafe was built with help from US aid, which helped the group's founders organize fundraising campaigns for several months. The cafe has since been closed. US aid no longer helps. And as for the founder, Nana Bagalishvili, she's now classified as an enemy of the state of Georgia. No military buildup is possible for Georgia while Russian influence still exists. Moldova finds itself in a similar situation. Russia's influence is spreading through propaganda and bribery in the country. For instance, ahead of the country's October 2024 elections, Russia began sending people into the country carrying cash. Sums of up to $7,500 were in those people's pockets, with the money having a singular purpose: buying votes for the candidates that Russia favored. Russia was attempting to oust Maia Sandu, who was the president at the time and was running for re-election on a pro-European ticket. Russia failed, and Sandu achieved re-election. Right now, there are thousands of Russian soldiers stationed at Transnistria, which is a breakaway state that is officially recognized as part of Moldova but faces increasing Russian influence. Like Georgia, Moldova also faces issues related to Trump cutting US aid funding. For instance, teams in Moldova that oversee the country's elections are being forced to send people home because the money has run out. Again, that creates the perfect situation for Putin to expand his influence in a country he wants to control. Therein lies the key behind Eastern Europe's military buildup: control. The likes of Estonia and Poland see Putin for what he really is. They see Russia as a country that wants to do nothing other than control as much of Europe as possible. The only way to combat Putin's desire for control is to build up, to show Russia that Eastern and Central Europe won't capitulate to what Putin wants. Georgia and Moldova are already struggling under Russian influence. Estonia and Poland don't want to share the same fate and will prepare themselves, with or without the help of the US. But what do you think about Eastern Europe's military buildup? Will it be enough to stop Putin? What role, if any, will the US play should Putin turn his attention to other European nations if he wins in Ukraine? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Russia Can't Believe It, Poland Seeks Nukes and a 500,000 Army, or click this other video instead.